First one coming up is with Federico Baraya Galan. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He's an author and a content creator focused on service design, and he works at Haptica in Colombia. And he's going to talk to us about storytelling, service design, and schizophrenia. And he'll talk about a project in which he used storytelling to break down stigmas around the disease of schizophrenia. So, looking forward to that. Take the stage, Federico.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So, yeah, let's begin. Maria Paula, a 17-year-old teenager, was at her home watching TV. And she started to listen that the phone at her house was ringing, you know, a non-stop sound bugging her. And she didn't understand why her parents weren't answering the phone. So she got up of bed, feeling a little bit odd out of herself because she wasn't taking the meds she was supposed to be taking. And she got to the phone and answered it and started listening on the other end of the line. These weird voices that she couldn't recognize, but after a few seconds, she understood that the voice came from her mother. And her mother was trying to tell her that she was in danger and she had to run away because those who were acting as her parents were two actors or two imposters. And in order to be safe, she had to run away from her house. Hello, my name is Federico Baraya Galan. I'm a content creator and a writer. I work at a service design agency or consultancy in Colombia called Haptica. And today I'm gonna speak about storytelling, service design, and schizophrenia, a project in which I truly believe we started to change a bit the reality for those who suffer from schizophrenia. So before we get into the theme of this talk, I want to ask you this simple question. What do you think these four art pieces have in common? So we've got the Starry Night by Vincent van Gogh. We've got Alice in Wonderland, Mr. Robot, the series, I believe it's from AMC, and the book Fight Club, which was written by Chuck Palahniuk, and nowadays it's a really famous movie. So what do you think these four art pieces have in common? I want you to think about it, just a few seconds. So maybe if you were thinking about, schizophrenia or mental illness, well, you were right. Somehow these four art pieces talk about mental illness. It's not the main theme, but somehow in a way or in another, they're speaking about schizophrenia. And when people talk about these art pieces, they're speaking about this illness. So let's begin by understanding what is schizophrenia. So schizophrenia is a severe mental disorder characterized basically by distortion in thinking, perception, emotions, hallucinations, and delusion. So the hardest thing about schizophrenia is that it cannot be cured, but it can only be treated. And if you got the right treatment, the right caregiver, the right doctors, maybe you're gonna be able to have a normal life in which you can have a job or a stable relationship. But normally people who suffer from schizophrenia are people who are pushed away from society. And the people who suffer from schizophrenia, you know, these kind of people who believe that they're being pursued or followed, or maybe that Barack Obama is sending them messages through the TV or through the news or through the radio. So it's really hard to have schizophrenia or suffer from schizophrenia. But let's talk about demographics. It is considered that 20 million people worldwide suffer from schizophrenia. That's at least 7 times the complete population of Uruguay. So it's a lot of people who suffer from schizophrenia. And people with this illness are 2 or 3 times more likely to die. Not because the illness itself, but because they can develop heart diseases, vascular diseases, and mainly because they commit suicide because they can't handle anymore the burden of the illness. And finally, and most importantly, people or patients who suffer from schizophrenia are constantly stigmatized and their human rights are constantly violated. As I was just saying, people with schizophrenia are pushed away from society. They can't have a job, they can't have relationships, and that's because mainly we as a society we don't understand the disease and we are afraid of this illness. So it's really important to get to know this, because later on this talk, we're going to see why it was so important. So let's begin to talk about the story behind this project. Everything began in 2019, a year earlier from COVID-19, a year before, it changed at least completely the reality in Colombia. And one of the biggest pharmaceutical companies in the world came to Aptica, to us, and they wanted us to resolve, I believe, an easy brief, an easy question with service design or design thinking. And the question was, why psychiatrists aren't formulating our clients' product for their patients, although it has proved to be the best medicine in the market for treating schizophrenia. So as you see, it wasn't a really difficult question or brief, but what we didn't know at that time was that the project was going to be so big and so different at the end. So what we do at Aptica and our team, what it does normally is that we first create this kind of hypothesis. We want to go and talk with the users we need to interview. And we've been working a lot with doctors and physicians, and we know things about them. So, for example, we know that dermatologists are really visual people. So they like to get to know the before and after a patient using an explicit medicine. On the other hand, we've got the rheumatologists that we know they're bookworms. They like a lot to study. They know a lot of things. So when a sales representatives get into their office, they expect from him or from her to know a lot of things about their molecule, to have arguments, to have clinical trials. And we know this about dermatologists, rheumatologists, and other specialties. But the big question we had at that time was, what about psychiatrists? What do we know about psychiatrists, and what can we do? And we didn't know much about them. So we went and interviewed them. So we had 20 interviews with 20 different psychiatrists here in Bogota. And I've got three things really important here for you. The first one is science versus art. So what we found out was that what they told us was that formulating patients with mental illnesses and schizophrenia is really difficult. And it's more of an art than a science, because they don't know exactly what's going to happen if they formulate them with this medicine or the other. The second one we've got is the mental burden. So at the end of every day, psychiatrists told us that they ended up so exhausted and not in a good mental place. So they went to, and they looked for help themselves. So they went to psychiatrists and they had sessions. And the last one, and most importantly for our project, was art is their ally. So I remember clearly being in this psychiatrist's office, talking to her, interviewing her, and I asked her what made psychiatrists different from other specialties. And she told me that the thing that made different psychiatrists was that they saw patients as a whole. A holistic view of them, not only physically, but how were they emotionally, spiritually, what were they thinking? And she thought that maybe that was linked to the fact that psychiatrists are the more humanistic side or version of doctors. And that, she told me, could be also linked to the fact that psychiatrists enjoyed a lot art, not only movies, but music, reading books, going to museums. And she told me, and she was really specific on this, that it wasn't a thing about leisure, like she wanted to read bestseller, but because art helped them to analyze mental illness. And it was common for them to gather around with peers and analyze, for example, A Brilliant Mind, the movie, and get to know if the character had schizophrenia or maybe paranoia or maybe bipolarism. So they did that. And when I got that information, I was so astonished that I went into the team and I told them, well, I got this information. I think there's something behind it. We should get a little bit more and ask more about it. So we started asking psychiatrists about it, and we found out that it was a link, it was a trend or something that characterized the psychiatrists. So we knew now that art could be something we could use in order to change the approach the sales representatives were having with the psychiatrists. But we also looked into history to know really well why art could be the thing that they liked. And we found out that throughout history, art has been the vehicle to speak about forbidden themes. And schizophrenia and mental illness is a forbidden thing. Nobody wants to talk about it. At least in Colombia, we've got a saying in Spanish that is, la ropa sucia se lava en casa, which translates into a little bit like, you don't talk about family business with people who are not your family members. And so it's really common in Colombia to have a family member with any kind of mental illness, and you're not supposed and you're not able to talk to anyone about it. So these people tend to be pushed away from society, and we don't acknowledge what they're suffering. So we started to see that art was a better way to get the conversation on the table. And people used to talk about movies, used to talk about books and music that talked about schizophrenia, and they didn't know. So we thought, what about we get this thing of art and we change the pitch of the sales representative, which is a pitch just to sell, and we make them tell stories to the doctors. And that's how, well, before getting into the name of the campaign, it's really important to know who are the sales representatives. So for those of you who have worked with health projects or pharmaceutical projects, you might know that sales representatives are those people who go into the offices of psychiatrists or doctors, and in 2 or 3, 4, 5 minutes, they have to tell all the information they can to the doctor. And normally the doctor doesn't feel really comfortable having them there, and they try to find all kinds of strategies. So we knew that we needed to create something for the sales representatives. And that's how we came to this idea, which is called Schizophrenia is Not a Short Story. So we knew we wanted to do something about art, but we didn't know what. And after a few sessions, we created 4 short stories we wrote down with the client and the sales representatives. And these 4 short stories were based on patients' lives, patient stories. And we added to these 4 short stories all the methodology I know of creative writing. So we were really interested in knowing how to open the short story, how to make a plot twist, how to create characters, and how to end the story in order to get the attention of the doctors. And when we had the 4 short stories, we thought, well, now what? What are we going to do with these 4 short stories? Because we couldn't go to the doctors and just give them the short story and tell them like, tell us what you think about it. We needed something to get information in real time. And that's when we thought, well, what would happen if we change these 4 short stories into storytelling? And we get a storyteller to go to the doctors disguised as a sales representative, and he tells stories, or she tells stories as if he was or she was a sales representative. And that was what we did. So what we did was that I disguised as a sales representative, and I went into one of the biggest mental hospitals in Colombia called Nuestra Señora de la Paz. And this mental hospital is the one you can imagine from television, from movies. It was really old, and there were patients through the corridors talking to themselves. There was this guy who was listening to a radio in a really loud volume, and it was really hard to be there. And I was sitting at the cafeteria with another sales representative, and the sales representative was telling me, you've only have 5 minutes. That's all you've got to tell the doctor the story you came to tell him. And I was like, really nervous because I needed at least 15 minutes to tell the story. And I thought, well, let's see what happens. And the doctor came, sat down, and I told him we were prototyping this campaign and this idea, and I started telling him the story. So I could feel at the beginning of my story, his eyes gazing at me, saying like, what on earth is this guy doing here? Why is he talking about a man? And why is he telling me a story while I could be, treating my patients or doing anything else? And once I got into the middle of the story, I could feel his change. Like he was sitting in another way, he was looking at me in another way, and he was asking me questions. Like he was interrupting me to ask me questions about the story. So this particular story we wrote, it's about a guy who is under a lot of pressure, and at the end of the story, he commits suicide. So when I told the end of my story, the doctor got his hands to his face, and he was just like, this cannot happen. I've got a lot of patients who are going through the same things, and you really impacted me with this story. And we had in those brochures that you are seeing now, a little question in the middle to ignite a conversation. And when I did that little question to him, he started telling me about his patients. And I realized we were changing the dynamics behind, you know, the relationship between a sales representative and the psychiatrist. And he started telling me about his patients, and he started telling me that he wanted the brochure and he wanted the story with him because he wanted to tell it to his patients and the family of the patients in order to explain them maybe the things they can go through because of having schizophrenia. So at the end of this first prototype, he ended up with a brochure, and he told me to create a little bit more of stories and more brochures so he can tell to go and give it to his patients. And after that, we did another prototype with another story. This story, you have to imagine, this is a person or a patient who suffers from schizophrenia and he doesn't know, and he drinks a lot, and he goes into a social event, a party, and he drinks too much and ends up with a psychotic breakdown. And I told this to another psychiatrist, and at the end, the psychiatrist started telling me that one of the biggest problems in Colombia was that people didn't know that what schizophrenia was. So they didn't know that by abusing substances like alcohol, drugs, or marijuana, they were being held into schizophrenia, and they could end up badly. And she took the brochure too, and she told us about her patients, and we had a really good moment. And then we came into the third story, which was about a girl who smelled all the time that things were getting burned, but nothing was getting burned. And this was based on a real patient story. And at the end of the story, this patient is diagnosed with schizophrenia, and she gets a really good treatment, and she's out and she's having a normal life, like a normal job, and she's having normal relationships. And being based on a patient's life, when I told it to the psychiatrist, he was like really astonished and believed that maybe by treating patients in different ways and looking for better answers might be the solution to the problem he might be having with some of his patients. And lastly, we had this short story that was the one with that I started this presentation. So it is based on a teenager who stopped taking her medicine for schizophrenia, and she thought that the phone at her house was ringing, but it wasn't ringing. And I told this short story to the principal of this mental health hospital. And when I ended up my short story, she was crying. And she told me that she had a series of patients with teenagers with the same problems, and that she was really scared about it. And at the end, it was really good to talk with her. She asked us to create more stories, to create podcasts, a lot of things. So that was in 2019, but let's go really fastly from what did we do. So we had 4 stories, 7 times we told them, and we had feedback by 7 psychiatrists. And these were some of the results. So 91% of them told us that it had a really big impact on them. 77% of them had a relation with the story, which was really important, because if they didn't relate it with the story, we were not going to be able to open them up and to know the story of their patients and what they needed. 85% of them told us that this was a really incredible way to innovate the sales pitch of the sales representatives. And 97% of them told us that they would talk with their peers about this campaign, not only about what had happened, but to analyze the stories and what has happened with the characters in order to get a better solution. And that was in 2019. Nowadays, we've got podcasts, we've got mailing campaigns, we've created more stories. And I believe that at the end of this project, we are changing step by step a little bit the reality of patients with schizophrenia. So, you know, we as a society push them away, but now it's time to acknowledge that this is an illness, and maybe little strategies such as changing the language, not calling these people who are sick, you know, lunatics or crazy people, that can make a little change for them and acknowledge and get to know them. And that was it. That's what I brought to you today. That's this project about service design, schizophrenia, and storytelling. My name is Federico Baraya, and I really hope you enjoyed this talk.
Great. Thank you, Federico. And thanks for the nice visuals that really pulled us into the story of those patients. Thanks. And we see you in the Q&A.